Welcome to the SKB's next Zoom and Share, coming to you directly from everywhere. And we are honored to have Laurin McCreackin with us today. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a background on Laurin, those of you who may not know Laurin, but Laurin's actually a pretty big deal. And I thought I'd give you a little background, some of which you may not know. He's got a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Architecture from Rice University. Who knew? Architecture, wow. And he's got a Master's in Architecture and Urban Planning from Princeton University. See, I told you, he's a big deal. And, but Laurin is one of the top watercolor painters in the world. He's in a whole bunch of the top watercolor societies: American Watercolor Society, National Watercolor Society, Transparent Watercolor Society, Southern Watercolor Society, Watercolor West, Watercolor USA, Honor Society, and he's an elected member of the Allied Artists of America in their water media category. And he's been in a whole bunch of shows over in China, and you should go and look at his website and stuff. That's very fascinating. China has become a powerhouse in water media, and Laurin has been in a whole bunch of those shows. And he's in a lot of permanent collections, and but he's a sought-after lecturer, and he is an author, and he's a great guy, and he's a great painter. So without further ado, here's Laurin.
Thanks, David. You read it just like I sent it to you. Thank you very much. Well, it's such a treat to be with my SKB friends here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about where watercolor came from, because, and this is not an art appreciation class. There are plenty of people out there, and David does a great job of doing a history of watercolor by talking about the great watercolorists and how they contributed to the art of watercolor. But what I'm going to focus on are the social, economic, and physical aspects that led to the significant growth of watercolor into a major art medium that it is today. Now, we all know that people have used water media since the beginning of time. We all know about the cave paintings in France. Those of you who paid attention to the news lately, you are aware that they've recently found some cave paintings in Southeast Asia that are hundreds of thousands of years older than the ones that are in France. So it goes back a long ways. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this presentation is pretty much to debunk the fact that the Chinese started watercolor, because that's what everybody preaches and that's what everybody believes. Now, I give the Chinese full credit for 3,000 years ago. They started painting with water-based inks on rice paper and mulberry paper. And over these thousands of years, they've refined that to a very stylized approach to art. But it bears little or no physical relationship to the way we paint in watercolor today and the way that that we paint. And in fact, the Chinese in the last 30 years have developed on a Western approach to watercolor. And except for a couple of universities in northern China, if you go to China today, they paint with a lot of the brushes we paint, and they paint on regular watercolor paper with the same watercolors we do today. So where did they learn how to do that, and where did we learn how to do that? Now, the first watercolorist that we can point to with any definition that painted the way we do today is actually Albert Durer. And let me see if I can do this. All right, can everybody see this Albert Durer painting?
Yeah, good.
This is watercolor on paper, and you can see the date is 1512. Albert Durer at the time lived in Nuremberg. He became a very, very successful painter, primarily through his printmaking. And then he turned all of his money over to his wife, and she invested it in real estate. And when he died, he was the eighth richest man in Germany, thanks to his wife and her investments in real estate. Isn't that fabulous? Anyway, Durer did a lot of studies like the wing and other things, but he did a lot of finished watercolors, and this is actually just a sketch. At one point, he walked from Nuremberg to Rome, and this is when he was just a young man, 17, 18 years old, had no money. He hadn't reached any amount of fame at that time, but he would stop every evening and make a sketch like this, and then he would go into the little town and trade it for a night's lodging and a meal. And we have several hundred of these watercolors. It is interesting that the further and further he went, the looser and the looser the paintings became, because he realized he was taking so much time in the afternoon to paint these scenes, he was never going to get to Rome. So they became looser and looser and looser the further he got. All right, we'll go back to where I was. All right. And in the Middle Ages, we know that the monks used water media to illuminate Bibles and other religious documents, ground their own paints, and use them in a very primitive style of application. But what I want to focus on is, where did the development of what we have today, which I define as using ground pigments in water enhanced with other elements like oxgall and honey to paint on a paper substrate? And while there are a lot of histories out there about watercolor, everybody seems to mention a little bit of something here and a little bit of something there. So I wanted to know a little more about all this. So I pulled all the books I had on the history of watercolor together and have put together what I'm sharing with you today. I have not found anything complete that covers the kind of things that I'm talking about today. So what I'm going to talk about is the beginnings of modern watercolor, which are from 1750 to 1836. I'm not going to go through everything, but I'm going to hit the highlights. And I think it's interesting that watercolor comes to us primarily through four groups of people that used watercolor in this same period of time. And the first were the royals. I think it's interesting that during this period of time that all the members of the royal family were taught to watercolor. And we'll see how that impacts the modern history of watercolor lately. We all know that Prince Charles today is a watercolorist, and he's a patron of all of the watercolor societies in England and Scotland. But we'll come back to who really made a difference. And then the wealthy ladies of this particular time. This is a time where wealth was really growing in the landowners. And if the lady was in the household of a wealthy landowner, she could not work. There were a very limited few things that she could do. She could make lace, she could knit, she could do needlework, she could embroidery, or she could watercolor. And this is how watercolor started to spread all over England. There were itinerant instructors that would go to these estates, and they would be put up in, depending on their status, they would either be put up in the servants' quarters or the garrets or in a guest room, and they would stay there for sometimes weeks and sometimes months to instruct the ladies in the estate on how to watercolor. And then the surveyors and engineers of the time used watercolor to not only to map the lands that they were surveying, but to do watercolor sketches to show that the land was rolling, or that there were deep creeks, not just creeks running through the land. But I think one of the most interesting things is how watercolor really impacted the world was the fact that all military officers above a certain grade had to become very competent watercolorists. And so they could record as they traveled on behalf of the Queen all around the world. Every man of war had a botanist and a staff of officers who could watercolor and whose job was to record and paint the local lands, the structures, the local population, the flowers, the fauna, and all of these lands, so that when they would go back and report to their commanding officers and eventually report up to the Queen, they could illustrate what they have seen. These obviously in the days before cameras. So this really spread the knowledge of watercolor in the British system all over the world. And even today, we see this impact. We see there are more watercolorists in India, for instance, than in almost any other place besides Northern Europe and North America. And that's because of the period of time that India was ruled by England from the mid-19th century, and they taught Indians to paint. Now, if we go back to England during this period, one of the most significant things that happened to the growth of watercolor and the growth of painting in general, I must say, was that there were the creation of societies of artists. We all know since the beginning of time that all artists have fought to find audiences that want to buy their paintings, right? So the painters in England started to glom together during this period, and they created the Academy of Art in London. Now, they weren't just London artists, but they were usually from the southern and central part of England. And later, the Academy of Art received a royal warrant and was encouraged in their effort by the Crown, and it became the Royal Academy of Art. Now, this society was mostly made up of oil painters, but it included all kinds of other medium, including watercolor. You have to remember that at this time, watercolors weren't considered a serious art. And even when these ladies learned how to paint in these estates, and the military officers that knew how to paint painted a separate watercolor, usually they didn't go into a frame. It just went into a paper mat and was put in a volume and created a book, a record of their watercolors. But during the 1700s, subsets of the Royal Academy and other watercolorists got together and wanted to promote the profession of watercolor. Remember, we're coming after the age of the guilds, and so we needed something to codify what they were doing, so it became a profession, and therefore they could sell their art for real money. This is true of oils and all other water medium, but obviously true of watercolors. So within the Royal Academy, there was formed in 1804 the Society of Painters in Watercolor, and this got the attention of the Crown and was championed by the Crown, and they became the Royal Society of Painters in Watercolor. And so not only did the Society of the Royal Academy of Arts justify the artists being able to sell their oils for money, then the Royal Society of Painters in Watercolor gave the justification for watercolorists to be able to sell their watercolors as a professional painter. Similar thing happened in Scotland pretty much during this same time. A little bit later, the Scottish Society of Painters in Watercolor was formed, and then in 1886 it received a royal warrant and became the Royal Scottish Society of Painters in Watercolor. Let's talk a little bit about who some of these people were. I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion here, but for those of you who aren't familiar with the people that helped do all of this, let me just introduce you to a few. And I can there are a lot of significant names. There's William Reeves. Here we have Thomas Girton. These people really created the standard by which watercolor was judged. There's another Thomas Girton. Here's John Sell Cotman, a very light reproduction. But John Sell Cotman was the master of the continuous wash. And one of the things that Cotman did was that smooth wash above the viaduct and those smooth washes below and the washes in the water are all perfect, and they're all exactly the same color. Nobody had done this kind of detail in watercolor before. And of course, one of the great painters of English history is James Millard William Turner. I hope all of you have seen the great movie, Mr. Turner. I highly, highly recommend it. But Turner was an accomplished watercolorist and loved to paint in watercolor. And then we got John Frederick Lewis here. And Lewis was famous both as a technician and for the subject matter. Lewis went all over the Middle East, the countries we know of, Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Yemen and places like that, and painted a lot of on-site, did a lot of plein air painting, and a lot of these finished paintings were actually done in his tent out on the desert. And one of the things that John Frederick Lewis was famous for, let me see if I've got one more of his paintings, yes, was the graded wash, those beautiful sky that starts very, very nice and deep cerulean at the top, but fades out to almost white at the bottom. He's the person that started at the standard for painting skies and developed the continuous wash. Constable was a wonderful watercolor painter, and his Clouds and Skies also became a standard during this period. I'm going to leave this up as a talk for a minute because I'm going to come back to this in just a minute. There were other people, names will come up, David Cox, Peter DeWitt, William Blake, Whistler, all these people contributed to the history of English watercolors. These people all got together, and under the guidance of John Robert Cozens, C-O-Z-E-N-S, I encourage you to look him up. Cozens actually wrote down and codified what we know today as the British transparent watercolor techniques. And so all of these famous watercolorists ascribed to the British watercolor technique, and those included such techniques as continuous wash, graded wash, broken wash, painting wet into wet, wet into dry, dry brush, the famous British two-brush technique, which I hope you're familiar with, blotting, lifting, masking. All of these things were part of the codification of the British watercolor technique, the British transparent watercolor technique. Let me emphasize that. And that is what has spread all over the world and come down to us today as the standards for painting in watercolor. Obviously, between that period of time and now, a lot of new things have been added, a lot of new techniques. I mean, there are a lot of new ways to lift and blot and that sort of thing, but they all go back to this, what was codified during this period. Now, 1837 becomes a really big year, not only in English history, but in the history of watercolor, because Queen Victoria, fifth in line to the crown, became the Queen of England in 1837. And remember that this was a really magnificent age in the history of England. This was the really opening up of the industrial age of England, the steam engine, the cotton gin, and all these other inventions that took England ahead of all of Europe, out of hand labor into the machine age. And this had an incredible impact on the growth of watercolor. Queen Victoria, not unlike all the royals, was a watercolorist, and she really enjoyed watercolor. She traveled a lot, as we know, not only within England, but all over Europe. And so she carried with her everywhere her watercolors. She was a really good plein air painter. This on the screen here is a little portrait of her son Arthur that she did out at Windsor. And this is when she was visiting Coburg. And this is the view outside of her apartments as they were assigned to her in Coburg. And what you're looking down on, past a wonderful oriel window there, down into the village market scene. And there are a lot of wonderful watercolors by Queen Victoria. Many can be seen in London in the Queen's collection in the Royal Palace there. So let me come back to, there we go. What happened in the industrial age was that a lot of tools became available that made watercolor more accessible to more people. Not only did it drop the price of it, but it made it much more accessible. The Reeves brothers here, who were major watercolorists and leaders in that field, became even more famous because they started one of the first stores in London where you could buy art materials and particularly watercolor materials. The two major improvements that really impacted this period was that paints became available in moist cakes, and they became available in liquid in tin tubes. Now, prior to this, all the painters had to go to their apothecary or their colormen, as they were called at that time, and get dyes, stones to crush, oils to mix with all of this, and they had to grind up and make their own watercolor. Turner's father, who had been a wig maker and a barber, once Turner became reasonably wealthy, he got his father to give up his business and move into his townhouse with him, and he became his color man. He would go to the apothecary and buy the dyes and then come home and mix the colors for Turner. Now the problem was the primary way you stored your watercolors were in glass containers. There were a lot of glass jars that sealed during this time, but that wasn't very good for plein air painters or people like Turner who traveled a lot and wanted to take. You don't want a lot of broken glass in your carry-on. The invention of the tube became a huge impact. And remember, during this period of the industrial revolution in England, tin mining made lots and lots of fortunes in England. And the American, John Goff, he's from Charleston in the United States, was visiting in England, and he observed all this. He wasn't necessarily a painter, and he really wasn't much of an inventor, but he had this idea that if you flattened out some of this tin and you folded it, you could make, and crimped it on the end, you could make a container for liquid objects. And you crimp them on the end, and so that replaced pig's bladders. Now let me go back to my my illustrations here, because I have a fun illustration about that walks you through all of this. Oops, that isn't what I want. No, this is what I want. You can see on the left there is if you were going to carry out your watercolors out with you to plein air paint, you would put them in pig's bladders. Well, the pig's bladders didn't hold very much, and they really weren't very good for storing things for very long because they dried out and they crunked and crumbled and made big, huge messes. And then the next thing that came along was Mr. Windsor, a familiar name, patented glass syringes to carry watercolor in, but again, they were very fragile and not very effective. And so when Mr. Goff invented the tin, Mr. Goff invented the tin, he wasn't even interested in making money for it, so he didn't patent it. So Mr. Windsor took over this idea and patented it and added to it a really, really important improvement. He put the screw top on it, and then went into a partnership with Mr. Newton, and the rest is history. They developed the most famous store in London that sold primarily watercolor materials. Both of them had been colormen prior to this, and really thought that being able to buy liquid watercolor would be a huge improvement. Now, the next big thing that happened, and I'll go back to these, is remember what was available as a brush at this time? Mostly oil painters. And what are oil painters painting in? They're painting with hog bristle brushes and stiff brushes. Great brushes for oil painting, and we still use those brushes, you know, filberts and things like that. We use those same brushes today in oil painting and other acrylics and other things, but there really wasn't a brush that was really suited to oil painting. The closest you got were some brushes made of feathers and some brushes made of squirrel hair. So a lot of these people, Cotman and Girton and Turner, and about some places I've read there were 12 painters. Some places I've read there were 14. Some places I've read there were 16 of these guys that got together and had an unofficial competition. And they invited, some say 5, some say 30, some say they invited every brush maker in England. But anyway, the competition was to come up with a better brush for painting in watercolor. And one brush maker, so far in my studies, has gone unnamed, which is a shame. If anybody can find this brush maker's name, I'll give you a set of Escoda brushes of their Versatile as a reward. Some man had access to some Kolinsky weasel hair that was sent to him from Siberia. And so what's important about a Kolinsky weasel hair? First of all, they're long, sometimes 2.5 to 3 inches. So you can make a really big, fat brush. The most of the brushes, the most economical ones, are between 1 inch and 1.5 inch. But so they're long and they're tapered, which makes them, if you put them together right, it makes a really fine point. But here, the 2 other things are really important. It has such a wonderful natural curve to it. Not all animal hairs are curved like this, and they're not all tapered. And it has a texture on the surface. So when you put it all together, oops, going the wrong way. And you crimp it into the ferrule, and you position all of the hairs properly, you end up with this fine tip, and then you end up with this really big belly in the brush, which is normally just full of hair. But if you put it into water, the way the brush is made, it sucks it up into the belly of the brush. And so you can paint a lot of watercolor just with one dip of your brush. When I first started painting, I started using a lot of zeros and double zeros from my little realism paintings. And in a wonderful conversation I had with one of the young members of the Escoda family, Ricard Escoda, when I ordered some brushes from them in Barcelona, he called me and he said, Laurent, he said, you keep ordering zeros and double zeros, and we'll be happy to send them to you. But do you realize that our number 4s and our number 6 have exactly the same point because of the Kolinsky hair that these small brushes have, and they have a lot more paint in them. So I started using the 4 and 6, and now I don't use the zeros. I never use the double zeros, rarely use the 0, and the number 4 has become my standard because of the fat belly that it has. I don't have to go back and refill my brush all the time, just as an aside. Now, so this became the winner of the competition and became the standard watercolor brush. Winsor and Newton made it very, very famous because this became their Series 7 that they made for Queen Victoria. And you can still buy the Series 7 out there. For many, many, many years, you couldn't buy a number 7 in the Series 7 because that was Queen Victoria's favorite brush, and they only made number 7 for the Queen. But today, you can buy the whole series. Today, they're not quite the same brushes that they were 20 years ago, but still not bad brushes. Now, what did this lead to? You got your combination of the codification of all these techniques, and then you've got all these new products, and so how to use them properly. How do you do a graded wash? So this developed a sub-technique where you need to tilt your paper in order to get the gravity to work with you to flow down the paper and create a continuous wash or a graded wash. And what the English determined was that the tilt of your paper needs to be between 11 and 17 degrees. Seems very arbitrary, but it wasn't. At 11 degrees, the gravity starts taking over the surface tension of the water and allows the water to flow. At 17 degrees, you lose the control of the tension on the surface of water, and the water just drops off the paper. I still don't figure out how people paint vertically, and now I don't know how people paint flat. It seemed almost impossible to do a graded wash painting flat. Some people can do it, but it's not part of the British watercolor technique. Now, there were a lot of changes in the substrate, and by substrate, I just mean what you painted on. But in the mid-18th century, there weren't any of what we call watercolor papers. The first person to make a paper that was considered manufactured for Whatman in England was Mr. Whatman, W-H-A-T-M-A-N, and you can still buy Whatman papers, and there's still a lot of artists out there that swear by Whatman papers. He produced one of the first what was called a Wove paper. Everybody else hear that too? So anyway, a W-O-V-E paper, and that was in 1780s. Now Fabriano, in Fabriano, Italy, the Fabriano Paper Company claimed that they created the first watercolor paper. They had been making paper for artists for a long, long time. They had a mold-made paper called Exposition that they still make once a year. And Michelangelo and Da Vinci have been known to draw and do washes on the Exposition paper. And there is thought that it was shipped to England during this period in the mid 19th, late 18th century or mid 19th century. But it's interesting that the Fabriano paper can't tell me when they first started shipping paper to England. They swear to me that they've got their archivist working on trying to find out what it is, and I'm interested to get that information. Now you've got a new substrate to paint on, you've got brushes, you've got the codification of watercolor, and you have the right as a watercolor profession to sell your paintings. So what was the next big development that impacted watercolor as a professional medium of art? That was the development of the watercolor gallery. You realize that before the mid-19th century, there was no such thing as a gallery. Even in Roman times and Greek times, where they did a lot of art, there was not a store you could go to and buy paintings. So what happened during this period was, if you wanted to buy a painting, if you were a wealthy person or a royal, you sent for the artist, and that artist came to you and showed you what their latest paintings were, and you would purchase them then. Or you would send for the artist and give them a commission to paint something, you know, the Battle of Waterloo, whatever it was. Or sometimes you would invite the artist to come to your estate. If you know the history of J.M.W. Turner, and greatly portrayed in the movie Mr. Turner, he would go and stay for weeks at a really fine home, and he'd be given a series of rooms, an apartment and a studio to paint in. And he would enjoy all the fine cuisine, and every evening there would be a performance, or one of the daughters would play the pianoforte, or something wonderful. It's a fabulous lifestyle. But there was no place that you could really go to and purchase a painting and look at a group of paintings. Now, what sort of served for this during this period was the shows at the Royal Academy, but they only happened a few times a year. And of course, what got in the show was juried in. So like the shows we have today, so you only got to see certain paintings. You didn't get to see an array of an artist's work. Well, during this time, Turner had a brilliant idea. He was becoming very well known and reasonably wealthy. So he purchased a second townhome, not too far from the townhome where he lived and painted with his father and the housekeeper. And he used that one just to show his paintings and to sell his paintings. And this became a breakthrough. And he became so successful that a number of his watercolor and oil painter friends and competitors, I'm sure you know some of the stories there, bought townhouses in that area, and that area became developed and known as an area of where you could go buy art in this new invention, art galleries. And so the system of gallery sales for art was invented during this period. Now, the problems that all these artists that had still are with us today. We're still fighting to find the clients. We're still fighting to get our price points up. We're still fighting against the oil painters saying that that's better. But the good news is that through all the things that I've told you, and through the continuing improvements of paper and paint and all of these things, and the instant availability of all these materials means that anybody and everybody around the world can be a watercolorist. And I think one of the more interesting things about this is that through the development of all of this is that the watercolor is today the most environmental friendly way to create art. You know, people sell cadmium yellows, but there's no cadmium in them anymore. They have been, that has been replaced with benign chemicals. Fabriano has just announced a new line of Artistico paper that has all vegetable sizing, the most green paper to be so brilliantly white in the world. So we get many artists around the world attracted to watercolor. And I think one of the interesting things that's happening in this pandemic period, there are two things. One is we're seeing a lot, both in oil, but it's amazing how many people are teaching online. And I could tell you for the next 30 minutes, things I've learned from my friends that are doing this all over the world. It's really fabulous. But I think one of the more interesting things is I've talked to a number of high school art teachers that ended up having to remotely teach art. And particularly in those private schools out there, those art teachers almost 100% gave up acrylics and oils and went to watercolor. So thousands and thousands of students across the United States are being exposed to watercolor, and they may never have been exposed to watercolor prior to that. So I think this is going to have a fabulous long-term effect on the growth of watercolor, not only in the United States, but I found this is true in Italy and some other countries out there. Let me say one more thing about the Chinese. As was mentioned earlier, I've made many trips to China and have been privileged to be in shows and give workshops and demos and all that. And in every case, the watercolorists there were practicing the art in the English method. They were using watercolor just like we use here, sometimes using different brushes, but they don't paint 1,000 chrysanthemums. They paint the same subjects we do. They paint portraits, they paint landscapes, they paint still lifes, just like we do. So this entire history of watercolor has become very circular. And now the Chinese are painting like we are. Anecdotally, I know that watercolor is growing all over the world. I stay very closely in touch with quite a number of the manufacturers of art materials. Fabriano, Daniel Smith, and Escoda are all sponsors for me and provide me my material, and I advise them on marketing around the world. And they are all reporting significant growth in their sales. In the last 3 years, Daniel Smith Paint Company has had to double their quantity of production twice in order to meet the demands of the growing market in the United States, and particularly their growing market in places like India and Germany and Italy. I think it's fabulous, and it bodes well for the future of watercolor. I hope that some of what I've been able to share with you today was new. I hope some of it was of interest. And if you want a hard copy of my little talk, shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to send you a copy in PDF form.
Don't forget, everybody, if you want to ask Laurin a question, please unmute your mic, and you can ask Laurin anything you like. Well, not anything, but mostly.
I don't have to answer.
There you go.
Email address?
LAURINMC, that's Laurin Mac, @AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, and there are lots of links to my email on the website. So I just bored you to tears, huh?
No, it was good. Thank you.
Very interesting. So
It was Laurin MC.
LAURINMC @AOL.com. David, you're a student of the history of watercolor, probably longer than I have. Would appreciate hearing what I missed and what you could add to what I said.
Well, first of all, I really enjoyed it, and partially because I know a lot of what you were talking about, but then there was stuff I didn't know. And everybody at a certain level in watercolor who really does spend time thinking about and learning about the medium. And everybody who paints in watercolor doesn't do that. Everybody who doesn't paint in watercolor, they just paint in watercolor. They don't care about where it came from. They don't care about the invention of tubes versus cakes. You know, they don't care about any of that. And I loved listening to what you're saying, because the education of artists to the history of watercolor will actually benefit you tremendously in terms of your confidence in watercolor as a professional medium. Oil painters have owned the high ground now for about 400 years. And, you know, I had a t-shirt made that said real artists use watercolor. And it pisses everybody off, you know, and I do it on purpose.
Of course.
And, but artists like you who actually have a real factual background and understanding of the brushes and the paper and the pigments and the different artists who did that, you're just throwing this out here in like an aside of, and it's just because it's all jammed in your brain there. And, you know, it's actually fun to exercise it once in a while, bring it out of the ghost. And because the rest of the time you're painting and doing stuff. Yeah. And it's.
Well, David, I do find that my peers out there, the John Salmonans, the Dean Mitchells, and the people like that, know a lot of this. And you know, for me, it comes out of my architecture background. As an architect, you wouldn't specify a particular window for a client without knowing a lot about that window. You know where it was manufactured, you know, what's the guarantees behind it? How long is it going to last? And it just was amazing to me how blasé most of the watercolorists were about these products, and the fact that, you know, people still just insist on painting with alizarin crimson, even though everybody will tell you it's the second most fugitive paint out there, and in 10 years isn't going to be there. Opera is the other one, and in 5 years it won't be there. But opera and alizarin crimson are two of the best-selling colors in watercolor. Just amazing.
Go figure.
Yeah, go figure.
And but your credential that you have as far as where you've been, what you've done, in addition to the fact that all you got to do is look at your work and look at what you do, and realize that monkeys can't do what you do. You know, this takes skill.
Yeah.
And it's something that requires a lot of patience, a lot of skill, but more that you don't paint the way I paint.
No.
I don't paint the way you paint.
No.
And I look at the way you paint, and I appreciate it tremendously.
Same in return.
I'm
in awe. I wish I could paint like you.
And you know, it's I've heard it from so many other painters that, you know, I love sculpture and I love glass blowing, because I don't do either one of those.
Yes.
You know, and so it enthralls me when somebody can do that.
Yeah.
And but you're unabashedly a watercolor guy, and so am I. And I happen to think that watercolor, I paint in oils and acrylics. I painted in every medium there is. But there's something about watercolor that when you really get in and start working with it, it's magic.
Well, I will say one thing that has happened in the last 5 years, which is, I think, had been pretty amazing, is that there are a group of probably 15, maybe 20 watercolorists around the world, and this just happened by osmosis, and just happened, and we started talking to each other and encouraging each other, and we've all been raising our price points in the galleries that represent our work and in our commission work, and we're pushing up there against the price of the basic oil painters now. You know, if somebody wants to talk about this in detail, I can mention numbers and things like that, but I can tell you that Dean Mitchell, for instance, a full sheet of watercolor by that fabulous painter can sell for $30,000 and $40,000.
Wow.
Man, that's all prices. And and I think part of the problem, we were just too shy and retiring to declare what the value of our work was.
That is definitely true, and it's widespread everywhere that I teach. And you know, I don't mind selling my demos and things like that for $200, $300, $400 in that range. And I've had people in my classes that go, you know, 400. I sat and watched you. That didn't take you but 45 minutes. You know, and I said, you know what? My lawyer, I charge the same fee that my lawyer charges me. He works at $350 an hour. I'm no less than that. So,
well, when somebody asked me how long that painting back there of William Faulkner's typewriter took me, I'll tell them it's 77 years.
right. Yeah, exactly.
I will point out my John Finley tractor behind me back there. Both of those are very recent paintings. I took that out on John Finley's ranch last year, and I just like machinery, and I love the faded reds. There's 7 different Daniel Smith reds in that tractor to get all the different ways that the red had faded as it moved around the ranch.
I think all the techniques and the information that you gave out today, if a painter takes the time of learning some of that rather than just painting in the watercolor, to me it's the same thing as when you look at the old painters and they painted in a suit. There's something that makes you feel like it's very special.
Yes.
And I think that does the same thing. Now, I wear t-shirts and jeans like everybody else. I'll try a suit someday, or a fancy dress with a bow in my hair. Somehow it has more apparent importance to us.
Yeah, it's like Sargent painting in that backdrop behind David there. It's in his fine suit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course we know that Cézanne and all those, and Picasso sometimes, you know, they always wore these great big dusters. But you know, Picasso mostly after he moved to southern France painted in flip-flops and shorts and t-shirts. So don't feel too badly.
Just one other question. I saw an exhibition of this Wove paper a couple of years ago. They didn't have too much information on that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Wove paper?
Yeah, Wove paper is mostly a handmade paper. And the wove refers to the weaving of the metal platen that they use to pick up the mush that makes the paper, and then they compress it, and you get and then you get that texture. Most wove paper has been replaced now with what they call mold-made paper. You can't make M-O-U-L-D, mold-made paper, made in a mold. Most paper today is made, actually it's made in a continuous roll. But in fact, if you go to the Fabriano website, there are a couple of really interesting, then they only last like 2 minutes, videos of how paper is made. One by machine and then another one by handmade papers that would really show you exactly what you want to know. They're really,
so is that
really
the same thing as what we talk about as just board paper like arches?
Yeah, wove paper is entirely different. Most wove paper today is used for stationery. Because here's the root of it. What made watercolor paper different than every other kind of paper up until that time was the sizings that go into it. Let me tell you just a little bit about, without risk of boring you, why, and this is true of many watercolor papers, but let me just talk about Fabriano. Fabriano paper is made, and it's just about the only paper, there's a Dutch paper that's similar, but Fabriano paper is made with long strand virgin cotton. And for instance, Arches paper is made up mostly of ground up fabric. And a lot of that is old denim. And it could be tablecloths. They buy used rags and crush it up and make paper out of it. Fabriano uses 100% virgin cotton. And then what they do as they make the paper, as they make the big soup that then gets poured into the molds or lifted into the molds, depending on whether it's machine made or handmade, they add sizing. And sizing is what holds the paper together. In many ways, it's like a glue, but it is water soluble. And so that, and depends on how much of the sizing you put in it. Arches, because it has all these little bitty giblets of crushed up rag, have to put a lot of sizing, a lot of glue in there. And that's why you can score a piece of Arches paper and bend it and it'll crack. What you're cracking is the sizing. Now you can't do that with Fabriano paper. If you were to score it and bend it, it would just bend because all of those fibers are so interlaced, they won't break down. So you have to cut a piece of Fabriano paper if you're going to cut it into smaller sizes. You can't break it like you can on Arches paper or a Hahnemuller or any of these other papers.
Is that why it feels so soft?
One of the reasons, yeah. Now, of course, I paint on 300-pound paper for lots and lots of reasons. But the great thing about the 300-pound paper is that one of the things I love about 300-pound paper, all other than that, for my technique, it's perfect. When somebody pays me $10,000 for a painting and I hand them that painting, they feel like they've got something of real substance. You know, it's stiff, it has body to it and all that. Now, the fact that I used it because I could cut it, I could scrape into it, I could blot it, I could really damage the paper and still have a finished painting means something else entirely. And one of the other things about the Fabriano paper, because they use the virgin cotton, it is the whitest paper that's made out there that's not bleached. Now, Arches will tell you that they do not bleach their paper, but if you start off with denim and you end up with a white paper, I'm not saying they're wrong, but I question.
A lot of French old socks is what it smells like.
Exactly, exactly. Now, remember that, talking about smelling of paper, even my old Fabriano paper, when I'm soaking it and drying in the bathroom, it just smell awful because for many years, part of the chemistry of sizings was horses and cows' hooves and horns, and they would boil that down. It started, Fabriano started 500 years ago making sizings out of rabbit skin, and they made really fine paper that they sold to the popes and people like that, but their sizing was rabbit skin. And they still make some papers like that. But the newer, so that means that a lot of these papers, when you do get them wet, they smell like old animals. But the new Fabriano paper is an all vegetable based green paper, and it won't have that kind of a smell to it once it's there. One of the other things people should be aware of, and so few people seem to know, is that, and if you watch this video on the Fabriano site, you'll see as the paper moves to the very end, there are these sprays, and it will say the finish sizing. And what they do is they do put a light coating of sizing as the very last thing before the paper dries and ships. And that's to protect the paper from all the handling that it gets in stores and in your closets and all that. Now, there are two schools of thought. There are a lot of people that have been painting on this paper with the sizing on it forever, and they think that's what the paper is supposed to be, and they've adjusted to it, and they love it. I don't want to interrupt any of people that need to rethink all of this. I take the shipping sizing off, and I do that by swishing it around in lukewarm water for just about 4 or 5 seconds. I mean, it is a very light coating, and you don't want the water to get into the paper and start interacting with the body sizing, because that will impact how the paper buckles and all that. But the Fabriano paper will just lie absolutely flat after you take the shipping sizing off, as long as you don't go into the body sizing. And that means that when I am painting the edge of a teapot spout, I can do that really, really soft edging in it to make it look round just by adding a little water, and that will take the pigment into the fibers of the paper and smooth them out. But it's difficult to do that if you've still got the shipping sizing on it, because you got to fight through the shipping sizing in order to get to the fibers of the paper. I learn a lot when I go to Fabriano and sit and talk with the people that actually make the paper.
I just sent out in the chat box a link to the Fabriano that you can watch later of their making of the paper on the
Right.
YouTube.
Fabulous, fabulous. And
Fabriano smells like cheese pizza.
yeah.
What's wrong with that?
Nothing wrong.
If you take Watercolor Artist magazine, if you'll look on the back of the new issue that's just out, it's the August issue, there is an ad for Fabriano paper that features me, my little photograph and one of my paintings. But down on the bottom here, if you want a free sample of the new Fabriano paper, it tells you how to get it. It's on the back cover of Watercolor Artist August issue.
Read your article, it was good.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's about how I do my blacks.
Yeah, so I have a question. Do you use cold press, hot press?
Aha, now that you ask, I give you the secret. I use soft pressed.
Oh, well.
Hang on one second. I think I can give you even a better answer. Yes. Doing a video for Fabriano in a couple of days about why I use soft press, and I came up with these. Is everybody, can you see this? This is rough, this is cold press, and this is soft press. And it really has to do with the difference between the hills and the valleys of the paper. Rough, as you know, has high hills and low valleys. So when you take a great big brush and you move it quickly across, the paint just gets caught on the tops of the mountains. And if you're a plein air painter, that's fabulous, because you use a big brush and the leaves of the trees and the waves practically paint themselves. And that most people like cold press, because with slight indentions in there, and if they're willing to let their brush widen and push it in there, they can do a continuous, but even then the paint tends to collect in the valleys. Now, I like soft press because it has practically no hills and no valleys, and I can move my fine point Kolinsky across that, and it doesn't deform the brush, and so the flow of the paint is consistent across the whole paper. So I get the same color, same coverage, same value, same intensity through the whole thing. And so in some parts of my realism, I need that. So that's why I use the soft press paper, 300 pound.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I recommend it. It's a wonderful, wonderful paper. Cheap Joe sells it. Dick Blick sells it.
What weight pencil do you use to draw your original drawing?
Ah, I love this question. I use a 2H lead in a mechanical pencil. And I do that for a real technical reason. For the last 300 years, architects and engineers, before CAD came along, drew in pencil and then sometimes ink on top of that. And what they learned is the 2H lead puts a very light line down, and that's how you do the blocking out of your drawing. And then once you did that, you'd come back with an H or an F and darken the lines that would actually make the drawing. So what I find is that the 2H gives me a visible line on the paper, but leaves so little carbon on the paper that it won't mix with the paint. I see people that recommend using a number 2 pencil or a 6B. And if you were to draw on a 6B and then come back with a light yellow next to that, it would pick up carbon from that 6B and you'd end up painting in green.
Yeah.
So that's why I use a very, very light pencil. Now, I use a projected image. I mean, sometimes I just draw it and paint it, but most of these really, really highly complex, particularly elephant sheet paintings that take me 150 to 200 hours to paint, the amount of information I need on there is so high, I use 3 line weights. My number 2 line weight is the outlines of things. My number 1, my lightest, is the details and the glassware and all that. And then I use a very heavy line to outline all the things I'm going to put masking fluid on, all the things I want to save, either to paint over later or particularly those things that I want to be the white of the paper. So, and I really recommend a mechanical pencil because you don't have to stop and sharpen it. It's always sharp and you get a uniform line all the time. And the other thing I recommend to people that take my workshop is don't go buy a Rotring $200 fabulous German mechanical pencil. The 79-cent one at Office Depot works just as well. It's not the holder, it's the lid.
Right.
Okay.
Well, folks,
I think we've had enough.
how are we doing? Any last questions?